O programa a seguir tem classificação indicativa livre.
Olá, este é o Cine Federal. O ano de 2014 é especial para os aficionados pela obra do escritor inglês William Shakespeare. Nesse mês de abril são comemorados 450 anos do seu nascimento. E o cinema, em mais de 100 anos de existência, já prestou homenagem à obra do bardo inglês em diversas oportunidades. Para se ter uma ideia, uma das primeiras adaptações de Shakespeare para o cinema aconteceu em 1908, quando o diretor norte-americano J. Stuart Blackton dirigiu um filme mudo inspirado na peça Romeu e Julieta, no Central Park de Nova York. Com o passar das décadas, muitas outras obras foram criadas tendo por inspiração os dramas, as comédias e os poemas de Shakespeare. Algumas se tornaram bastante célebres, como aquelas assinadas por artistas como Laurence Olivier, Roman Polanski e Kenneth Branagh. No programa de hoje, vamos assistir a uma entrevista com o professor de literatura inglesa da Universidade de Ohio, Samuel Crowl, que possui diversas obras editadas sobre as adaptações de Shakespeare para o cinema. O material foi produzido pela equipe da UFPR-TV durante um congresso sobre William Shakespeare realizado na cidade de Toronto, no Canadá. Confere só.
The decade of the 1990s saw a renaissance in Shakespeare on film. We had been through a long down period from the release of Polanski's Macbeth in 1971 and the simultaneous appearance of a film that I greatly admired then, though I don't think it has aged as well as I had hoped it would, which was Peter Brook's King Lear, a very dark, bleak Lear. But neither of those films drew an audience. They couldn't capitalize on the great success, public commercial success of Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet several years before. And I think the Hollywood money dried up that helps to finance almost all major films. So we went through a period of about 20 years in which we didn't have many Shakespeare films. Now, part of it was the BBC was doing those televised Shakespeares, and the notion was, well, the Shakespeareans are getting this stuff free on television. Why film? Then, of course, in 1989, a young man that no one had heard about in the world, only those who followed Shakespeare developments in England knew that there was this young fellow who had gotten himself a starring position at Stratford in the early 1980s to play Henry V. And then at the tender age of 27, almost competing with Orson Welles, he decides he's going to make a movie of Henry V, and he was scoffed and mocked. Well, Olivier had already made the great movie of Henry V. And he had trouble raising money. He could not find money in either the British film industry or Hollywood. So a man who had come to see the Henry V and come around to his dressing room after the show to say how much he admired him and admired his performance, said, is there anything I can do for you? I work in the city. I'm a trader in the city. I work in the banking industry. And Branagh said, yes, you can help me raise some money to make a film of Henry V. And the man went out and helped him raise the money. Then, of course, the film was a remarkable artistic success. People felt that a new take on the play and a new young, exciting Shakespearean had come along at the same time. Hollywood then rushed to acknowledge him, and he was nominated for Best Director. The film was nominated for Best Film. It didn't win any of those awards. It didn't make any difference. Shakespeare was back on the map. and this young man was helping bringing there.
No, my fair cousin, if we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Rather, proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse.
About the same time, Zeffirelli, who had been trying for some time to raise the funds to make a Hamlet, was able to do so largely because he cast Glenn Close as Gertrude and Mel Gibson as Hamlet, two well-known Hollywood stars. And while that film didn't do the sort of business Romeo and Juliet did, it did business. I mean, it made its money back. It played in the cineplexes in our world rather than the art houses. So there was a little excitement again in the world about Shakespeare on film because it was drawing an audience, a new audience, younger kids coming in to see both this young Englishman. I don't know how many students I had, mainly men, in that era who were turned on to Shakespeare because of Branagh's Henry V, which they'd seen because their mother made them go see it or their father did, and suddenly this was their Shakespeare and their guy. Then Branagh sort of doubled himself or tripled himself by bringing out a comedy in 1993, Much Ado About Nothing. By that time, he was married to Emma Thompson, who happened in that very year that Much Ado About Nothing came out to win the Academy Award for Howard's End. So they were the new hot English couple. They brought out a movie that had been made, once again, on a very modest budget. That tripled its costs and was a great success, particularly with the young. And so that made Hollywood all the more interested. Now, Hollywood was also interested because we were entering the age of what we call the independent film. That is, filmmakers who were interested in working outside of the big studios. And as a result, they made their little films on their own and then took them to festivals like Sundance or Toronto, where we are at this very minute, where then distributors or buyers would come along and be interested in picking up the film and distributing it. And companies grew up. Miramax was the most famous of these in America, who began to underwrite such small budget films in the hope that, having not invested much money, if the film was a great success, you got all the more return on your initial investment. And that happened in the case of several films. The English Patient was one of the ones that Miramax had backed. And so they got into this business, and then Baz Luhrmann came along and made his William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which became the largest grossing Shakespeare film in history. And so that sort of solidified this remarkable decade where one film followed another. In many cases, even the American great actor Al Pacino had been working for a long time in little bits and starts, using his own money to put together a film about the making of a film or a production of Richard III. And only after Branagh's success and Luhrmann's success did he get the money from a Hollywood distributor to finish the film. So it became known within the world of film that Branagh had really opened up the ability for Shakespeare films to be made. What I think is sort of interesting is that as the decade went on, the films became more experimental. Rather than becoming more conventional, they became more experimental, and paradoxically lost an audience. So one of my favorite films of the period is Julie Taymor's Titus, which is unbelievable. Titus, one of the toughest of the Shakespeare plays, and the toughest of the Shakespeare plays to stage, let alone think about filming, because it appears on the surface to be just a gory Gothic revenge play. But she found a very interesting way, filmically, to make us care about these people, to bring us into the terrible destruction of that world. But at the same time, it was experimental enough that I think it distanced an audience. So it didn't make much money, even though it was, I think, a brilliant film. Himself made a film that many people, I think, undervalue, but I loved because I loved 1930s American musical comedies. The Love Labor's Lost as a Cole Porter musical. I think it had wonderful energy and wonderful wit to it, but an audience didn't know what it was. Is this Shakespeare? Is this a musical? If so, musicals aren't popular anymore as a genre. So interestingly enough, as the decade progressed, and the filmmakers began to take more chances rather than less, they lost the audience that had sort of sustained them. Now, I think any revival, any renaissance, runs out of steam at some point. I mean, it just can't, it doesn't continue to build and build and build. But I think this one sort of came to a peak in at just the turn of the century, or the turn of the millennium. The last sort of film that I think rightly rounds it off is Almereyda's Hamlet. And great Count Branagh, of course, did his 4-hour Hamlet, and while I think that it probably is the most remarkable Shakespeare film we have, just thinking about filming 4 hours of that play and finding a way to do it. It has been denigrated, partly because of its length. Who does he think he is? What did he want? And it seemed to me that that was once again ironic, in that for years Shakespeareans like myself, people trained not as film scholars but as textual scholars, used to complain about films. Well, they cut too much. How can Olivier give us Hamlet and cut Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Fortinbras? So Branagh gives us the whole film, and we say too much. That's too much. That's too much Shakespeare. Why didn't he shape it to his own philosophy or whatever? Well, he was. Part of the philosophy was, here it is. Here's the whole thing. Nevertheless, that 4 hours precluded drawing a big audience. We know the film convention is 90 minutes to 2 hours. If you get over 2 hours, you're getting, you're in trouble with an audience unless you've got a really great film. 2.5, and whoever the producers are say, okay, you're going to cut this. We aren't going to release it. Branagh, who had final cut because those are the deals he makes, got away with being able to give us all of that Hamlet. Now, in contrast to that, at the end of the decade came along this little film by an avant-garde filmmaker, Michael Almereyda, which is sort of the anti-Branagh. It's, maybe an hour and a half, not quite 2 hours. It doesn't pretend at all to want to give us the whole play, but his version of the play. And so it's a nice little way of rounding off, it seems to me, this remarkable decade where we got something like 20 major Shakespeare films, plus then a whole series of spin-offs. Now, since then, it isn't as though Shakespeare films have disappeared, it's just that they've returned to coming out one every couple of years, and not one has yet reclaimed the public's imagination. at least in our country. So a film as interesting, once again, as Julie Taymor's Tempest with Helen Mirren, as a female Prospera, which is a film that I like a great deal, did almost no business whatsoever. A very interesting film by Ralph Fiennes, a British classical Shakespearean actor, also a great film actor, of Coriolanus, another hard subject to make into a film like Titus Andronicus. All set in the Balkans, sort of against the war in the Balkans in the 1990s. Set in the streets, the fighting going on in the streets. I think it has a wonderful dynamic to it and is sort of saturated with the media. Everything's being televised or filmed as the conflict is going on. It's being mediatized as our world is today. Everything is. Something happens in Brazil and it's known over the world in 24 hours, okay, or less than that. There are no secrets anymore. There are no little disturbances that take place in one part of the world that suddenly don't ripple through the rest of the world. Anyway, this Coriolanus picks up on that. But once again, tough film, hard to draw an audience to, didn't get such an audience. We just saw last night at the festival here a sort of interesting backyard film of Much Ado About Nothing, sort of taking on Branagh as a black and white film made by Josh Whedon. Josh Whedon, known to the young because he made a very, very popular film called The Avengers, bringing in a lot of the Marvel comic heroes that have populated the movies that are made in our culture for the sort of 14 to 20-year-old male, largely. Whedon took some of the profits from his recent success of The Avengers, brought a number of friends together, and in 2 weeks shot this little black and white film of Much Ado About Nothing. The film is interesting. It's got some moments that I admired, and I could write an interesting, I think, piece on it. I don't think it's going to do business, though. Even though it stars a lot of younger actors that at least American kids who watch a lot of television will recognize as people that are in long-running television series, I have a feeling that it's not going to be a sort of surprise wonder like the Henry V or the Much Ado About Nothing. But I'm glad that a major Hollywood director wants to turn his spare change and his spare time into thinking about Shakespeare. That's a good sign. So we had this wonderful period of the Renaissance in the 90s, and its prolificness did, I think, come to an end at the sort of turn of the century. In my own thinking, I think there's something that went on in the world between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the fall of the Twin Towers in 2001 that gave the world a little breathing space. It gave, at least the American world that loves to think about itself as always involved in some sort of crisis. So for many years it was the Cold War was the crisis, or the nuclear threat that emanated from the Cold War. And then we got a little decade of where we could breathe easy for a while, and those who live on hysteria settled down a little bit and were a little quieter. And I think it gave space for turning for material for film back to great classic authors like Shakespeare, like Jane Austen, like Henry James, like Willa Cather. And we got a host of films in that period that were less of the blockbuster kind of action heroes, doomsday films, etc. Now, after the Twin Towers, and now we're all preoccupied with terrorism. And so the films are once again sort of exhibiting that. But the Shakespeare film goes on, bubbling along beneath the surface, as it pretty much had done from the first Henry V film that set all this into, that's really set sound Shakespeare film in motion, which was, now I'm returning to 1944 and Laurence Olivier's film of Henry V, which would have seemed probably an odd Shakespeare play to become the first fully realized Shakespeare on film project, because we tend to think of Henry V as sort of a one-dimensional play, not nearly as rich as a Hamlet or even Henry IV Part 1, or as interesting as a character study as Richard III. But nevertheless, because of the moment, the Second World War, the troops gathering in England to invade France to reclaim Europe from Hitler and the Nazis, the film was sort of a glorious evocation of a grand British past, which championed the British cultural hero, old Shakespeare. And it worked. And it worked as a piece of propaganda, as a sort of wonderful war film, and as a exuberant sort of cherry on the top of the Allied victory. I mean, this film, which came late in the war, then I think actually its largest audience came post-war, pleased that the Brits and the West had triumphed, etc. And that then made Olivier think, okay, there's time now in this post-war period to think about Shakespeare and Shakespearean film, which led to his making of his monumental Hamlet in 1948, which also is the only Shakespeare film, other than Shakespeare in Love, and we can talk about that later, ever to win the Academy Award. So it got a great deal of attention. It was much heralded. After all, here was the great British actor of his generation discovering a way to make Shakespeare for him and his generation work on film. It's true that Olivier's Shakespeare films are more actorly, or you can see their stage origins, I think, much more obviously than you can a film by Ken Branagh or a film by Julie Taymor or Michael Almereyda. Nevertheless, he made Shakespeare work on film. And he found a way, particularly in each of his three Shakespeare films, to create an atmosphere that in many ways was daring. The fact that Hamlet film took a very strong Freudian interpretation of the play and Hamlet's relationship with Gertrude and Claudius and his father, even though it wasn't much noted by the immediate reviewers of the film. Anyone who looks at the film now sees how strong Freudian ideas that were in the air permeated, and Hamlet's relationship to Gertrude is obviously the key relationship in the film, as the famous bedroom closet scene is. It's a wonderful film because Olivier makes the camera an interesting partner in the drama. And that camera explores this funny castle and moves up and down these twisting stone staircases and pokes its nose in a room which turns out to be Gertrude's bedroom, and there's her bed with the wonderful drapes at the top of it, looking remarkably feminine and inviting and sexy. And then the camera pulling back from that. They can't get too close. And then finding little things off in the corner. So he found a way to begin to see how you could adapt the rhetoric and the grammar of film to getting at Shakespearean themes. In this case, the sort of shadowy nature, the mysterious nature of Hamlet and his world.
It's interesting that in terms of his career, Kenneth Branagh has more modeled himself after Orson Welles than Laurence Olivier. Branagh, once he became a filmmaker and a director of not just Shakespeare films, but of other films as well, has remained far more committed to film. He's only gone back and done 2 stage productions in the last 15 years. Only one of them was a Shakespeare production of Richard III, although this coming summer, that it would be the summer of 2013, he's going to do a production of Macbeth in Manchester at a festival, And we know that Macbeth is the next film role that he would like to do, and he must be thinking that because of the success of the Thor film that made $500 million worldwide or something, that he will have enough resources of his own to leverage funds to make a film of Macbeth. So let's hope that that will be the film coming for him. I think what's interesting about Branagh, too, is that not only being in the English tradition, he also reached out to Zeffirelli, and much of Branagh's sense of romanticism and wanting big moments and big camera work and pounding lovely scores by Patrick Doyle, that has to do with his Irish past, but it also has to do with what he stole from Zeffirelli and Zeffirelli's Italian heart that beat in a very rapid fashion when it came to Shakespeare, which is why some people don't like his Hamlet as much as the Romeo and Juliet. The Romeo and Juliet seems a natural subject for Zeffirelli, where Hamlet, the moody Dane, doesn't have the Italian blood, the hot Italian blood flowing through his system. And I think Branagh was also a great admirer of the Russian Kozintsev, Gregory Kozintsev. And Kozintsev is the other figure, along with the Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese director in the 50s and 60s, who really put his mark on the Shakespeare film. Kozintsev made two wonderful Shakespeare films, one of Hamlet and one of King Lear, that were helpful initially in overcoming a resistance from professional Shakespeareans to Shakespeare on film because they were in Russian. That is, finally somebody could concentrate on the images. They didn't have to worry about the Shakespearean language and what was happening to it. The films were both based on translations of Shakespeare by Pasternak, which were prose translations, and then the subtitles along the bottom tried to translate that back into Shakespeare. But I think it liberated a generation of Shakespeareans to looking at the pictures and seeing what a great filmmaker can do to capture visually what is the story that we all know from the language and the words. And so Kozintsev's Hamlet is focused on the sea, on the burning torch and burning fires in the fireplaces that eventually go dull and dry as the film progresses, on the stone walls of the castle, on the iron of the pikes. There's a great image at the beginning of the film. Hamlet comes, the camera follows Hamlet galloping home on horseback on a great white horse from school in Germany, and he gets to the castle and the horse clutters over the wooden entrance to the castle, which is like a drawbridge, and once the horse is on the inside of the castle walls, you see 12 men slowly turning this great wheel that draws the portcullis up to close the castle wall. And the whole notion of Hamlet being trapped, Denmark's a prison, is all there in that image. There he is, he's stuck, he's inside, he's in Claudius's world, and he's bound by it. So it's just, Kozintsev had a wonderful visual imagination for how to accomplish this, the Shakespearean texture. The Lear, in contrast, is a much bleaker world, as one might imagine. It was shot in Estonia. It's a barren, rocky landscape. You see lots. The people are never very far from the camera's eye in a Kozintsev Shakespeare film. And at the beginning of that, the people are coming from great distances, including beggars in little carts, because they are coming to hear the proclamation from the king that opens the play when Lear announces what he's going to do with his kingdom. And you have this sense of the peasantry moving in a sort of tidal wave to hear the announcement that's going to be made by the great king. And then the great king turns out to be this wiry little man, not at all what we expect when we think we're going to see Lear, who's going to be some monumental figure. No, small, tough, wiry. And once again, just giving you a new dimension, a new way of thinking about Lear. And in this, particularly in this film, there's a wonderful relationship between Lear and his fool. When we first meet Lear, the fool is sitting on the back side of his throne, on a little stool, little chair that's there for him. So you get this sense, like Olivier's Hamlet in the Light and Shadow, you get the king and the fool as part of one whole, or one divided personality, all right? The man of great excess and passion and emotion who is stubborn, and then the bright, quick, clever, witty, bitter fool reminding him. And of course that's an internal voice as well as an external voice reminding him what a fool he's been. So Kozintsev brought his own Russian sensibility to Shakespeare.
Дальнейшее молчание.
Japanese Akira Kurosawa films, of which Throne of Blood is the most famous, his version of Macbeth as a samurai warrior. So he goes brilliantly into the way in which Kurosawa reimagines him in a Japanese historical moment. And then he's been taken global. I think that's probably the post-90s movement in Shakespeare on film is into global Shakespeare. Mark Thornton Burnett has just written a wonderful book about Shakespeare sort of around the world, and the Chinese have discovered him, and there's an absolutely sensational version of Hamlet, which is now The Prince of the Himalayas, it's called. And it's a remarkable film made by a native Chinese, Sherwood Hu, who studied film in America but has gone back to China and is a part of the Chinese film industry. There are Iranian Shakespeare films now. There are, so the Middle East has picked him up. India has a number of very interesting and successful adaptations. Latin and South America, also big. Mexico, Brazil, I think there are famous Romeo and Juliet in Brazil, so that it's sort of remarkable. Film is the sort of the international art form. It moves. We can all go to films, and we can all go see them, because it isn't as though you have to move troops of actors from here to there. So that this is a way that Shakespeare is getting shared, again, with a huge audience worldwide, and also being reshaped by individual cultures as they come to him and reshape him, just as I think that there's always a distinction, just in my world, between American Shakespeare and British Shakespeare, as one who moves back and forth between those two worlds, that you see immediately the sort of differences. I'm talking now here about stage productions, about the way the Americans approach Shakespeare. I think they're willing to be much more experimental and wild, and set him against different backdrops, many of them with a North American element to them than the British often are, where they're guarding a tradition. And they're he's theirs, and they don't want to defile him too often. I'm probably being unfair there, but so Shakespeare on film remains strong, but the new strength is in the global. I like it when filmmakers who are established filmmakers who have no other connection with Shakespeare decide to do a Shakespeare film. And so Michael Radford, who made that film, was someone who was no connection with Shakespeare, had made a number of interesting films, and such people often bring new ideas, new ways of thinking about the material. And one of the things that seemed to me that he and Pacino did, obviously the play poses a problem that doesn't go away, which is what to do with Shylock. And so an actor, it's a very delicate line an actor has to walk between making Shylock overly sympathetic or making him a villain. Because in our world, he can't, anybody who can, give that wonderful speech, "If you prick us, do we not bleed," etc. That is, there's no question that Shakespeare is humanizing someone who in his own culture might have been depicted as a stage villain. If Shakespeare is taking that as part of his convention, then as always, he's doing something, he's humanizing it. But on the other hand, given the post-Holocaust world that we live in, it's very difficult often for an actor to give the bite to Shylock that has to be there. He's a tough bird, and he's angered, and he's mad, and he wants his revenge, and he wants his pound of flesh, and he's hurt by the desertion of his daughter and by the desertion of his daughter to the Christians. So it seemed to me that they found a way to sort of both place in historical context the ghetto in Venice, the treatment of the Jews within the ghetto, but also to let Pacino have a kind of toughness, a kind of anger, a kind of refusal to pander to our sensibility, our modern sensibilities. And then the film decides to do two lovely things, one not so lovely and one more so, at the end. One is that we get a shot of Shylock communityless. He's out in the rain, and he's had to convert as part of and the synagogue doors that shut against him, so he can't re-assimilate with his own tribe. He is not obviously going to become a Christian, whatever they told him that he has to do, and he's stuck. He's in no man's land. At the same time, one of the most poignant moments in the play is Shylock getting the report from his friend Tubal that Jessica, in her elopement, has traded a turquoise ring that Shylock had of his wife Leah for a monkey. And he gets this report, and film is something only film can do. Film gives us a point of view shot in Shylock's imagination of this ring. So we see the ring being offered by a hand, we take it Jessica's, out like that, and a monkey being received in return. Now, this is his point of view. This is what we see. So we know that ring. We know what it looks like. And it's a wonderful gold piece of filly. And then the turquoise is not flat. It stands up a great deal with delicate little gold holding in place. The last shot of the film, after everybody's back in Belmont, and we know that there is, in the lines that Jessica and Lorenzo share there, a melancholy. Jessica is not fully assimilated to the decision she's made. She too is in a bit of a no woman's land. And it's a dawn shot, and the reconciled lovers have gone off to bed. And it's a shot out over a lagoon where there are men in long canoes fishing. They're fishing with harpoons or something. And she's looking out with this melancholy look, and the camera zooms in on her hand that's resting on a balcony, and there's the ring. She has not given it. Something only a film can do. I mean, a stage production could never make that ring. We're too far away to make a detail that small, that large, so that we pick up on it. So once again, something very neatly done by the filmmaker to get at both the last vestiges of loyalty and estrangement in Shylock and in his daughter as the film comes to a close. So, and I think that's only something that maybe a filmmaker who was not a Shakespearean would have thought of doing, would have thought of a prop as a way of telling, putting a twist that is, a remarkable one and very much in keeping with the film. Now, the hope is that Redford and Pacino are going to cooperate again on a film of King Lear. But it's evidently run into some difficulties in terms of raising the funds. The same people who produced The Merchant of Venice are the ones that are trying to raise the money. So it's still a possibility that we may get a second Redford film. But he is, like Roman Polanski and Macbeth, Michael Hoffman, who made a very available film of Midsummer Night's Dream in the 1990s. All shot in Italy, again, following the Branagh example, and with lots of both American and British television and film stars, so it had a star quality. These are the sorts of people who come and tend to make just one Shakespeare film. They're not Shakespeareans, they're not people, and it's great. They bring a kind of energy from the outside into the mix for a while. So that's why I like it when that happens, and also why I admire the Redford Merchant. I see the soliloquy is the hardest convention that from Shakespeare's stage to refigure in film. How do we deal with the soliloquy? The soliloquy is also a particular convention of Shakespeare's stage, because Shakespeare's stage, as we all know, was a thrust stage surrounded on three sides by audience. So that actor was in much closer proximity to the audience on a Shakespearean stage than he is on a modern proscenium, the stage that we inherited from the 19th century, where the actors are all up there, we're all out here, and we're peering through an invisible fourth wall into their world. So when an actor stands alone on that stage speaking to us, it's more like an aria or scenes in an opera than an intimate exchange with an audience that surrounds you. So it was a natural device for Shakespeare's stage. And it's one that Shakespeare used because it gave him that access to interiority, which he is so known for, the psychological dimension of Shakespeare, most obvious in Hamlet, who has the most soliloquy. So what do we do with this when we get to film? Well, filmmakers have done all sorts of things. Olivier saw the advantage of using voiceover. Now, voiceover is something that we can do on film, that is hearing the actor's voice but not hearing words being spoken, that is hearing the voice on the soundtrack, so we know we're hearing the actor think. All right, he's just not expressing that thinking out loud. It seems perfectly natural. In the theater, that would seem absurd. So this was one device. And Olivier used it in Hamlet and the couple of the soliloquies that he kept. He cut a number very cleverly because he allowed maybe, 5 or 6 lines of the soliloquy would be in voiceover, and then the actor would be worked up enough that he'd say one word out loud. And in the opening soliloquy, that this too solid flesh would thaw, resolve itself into a dew, etc. When he comes to the line, frailty thy name is woman, as he thinks about his mother, that line is spoken. I mean, and that's a way of underlining that it's his mother's remarriage that has, at this moment, unnerved him, made him suspicious, skeptical, unhappy, melancholy. He can't figure out why she's done that. Later on, in the to be or not to be speech, it's when he gets to the moment opera chance to dream, to die, and then it's the notion of death that comes out, that gets spoken. So he was clever in being able to use the device of voiceover that film can do, but also cutting it up, interspersing it with the actor at certain moments, breaking into speech. And that probably has, for some of us, a psychological reality that we do think in our heads, and sometimes we find ourselves saying something suddenly out loud. And so it had a verisimilitude to it as well. Now, other directors, Branagh, for instance, in his Hamlet, speaks all of the soliloquies. He wants that. He wants to get his Hamlet charged by those words. The trouble with voiceover is it tends to be more passive because it's something that suggests the reflective mind. And I think Branagh's Hamlet is a far more active one than Olivier's. He's far more a man of action, far more someone less caught up in the psychological problems with his mother and much more fixated on Claudius. Branagh's Hamlet, somebody who wants to be king. I don't think there's a minute that I'm convinced that Olivier's Hamlet wants to be king. That is that what he's disappointed in is that he's missed the crown. Branagh's Hamlet wants to run the show. And so I think he wants all that language there as a way of articulating his own move toward action. Or at least at the beginning, the language is action. It's one way of doing something, talking about it in those terrific words. So he makes it work because he makes it a part of his visualization, his conception of the character. Sometimes we just reduce the soliloquies. We just take them out. Or a very famous example in Wells's Chimes at Midnight. There is one soliloquy in Henry IV, Part 1, where the young prince addresses directly the audience after Falstaff and his low-life friends have exited the stage. And it's a soliloquy that's very much between the prince and the audience as he explains to them what he's doing and why he's hanging out with these guys and how, when he plans to reform, how he's got to fit into a political theory of image politics, what that reformation will mean, etc. So it very much is a soliloquy that is, where the actor, I think, is not just talking to himself, he consciously is talking to an audience and convincing them about something he's prepared to do. Well, Wells knows film doesn't work that way. So he has he shapes the soliloquy with his Hal having exited the tavern, which is Falstaff's territory, and he's out on the gate of the tavern where we see in the distance the outlines of the castle wall. So the prince's position between the low-life tavern and the world of pleasure and holiday and that castle where his father lives the world of responsibility and running the country. And that's where he is caught at the moment, between pleasure and responsibility, holiday and work. However, Wells keeps Falstaff back at the doorway of the tavern in the shot. So you've got the castle, you've got the sort of the gateway outside of the courtyard that precedes the tavern, where Hal is poised, and then Falstaff back at the door of his establishment. Or what. The camera shoots Hal so that we see him speaking directly to us, but with Falstaff in the background. We quickly become aware that Falstaff is not hearing what Hal is saying to us. So we are able to comprehend what Hal is saying he's going to do, and Falstaff isn't brought into the equation until at one moment the prince says, "I'll so offend to make offense a skill, redeeming time when men least think I will." That is, I'm going to continue my bad behavior until I know it's the right time to reform, because the world will love the fact that I reform. And that at that moment, "I'll so offend," he turns and throws that line to Falstaff. "I'll so offend," and Falstaff smiles, meaning he's picked up that the prince is still in his giddy good spirits about being offensive. And then he turns back to us and said, okay, "I'll so offend to make offense a skill, redeeming time when men less think I will." So Wells manages to situate someone else in the world of the soliloquy, that is Falstaff, so it's not just the character alone, as well as the camera through which we are, through which the audience. So that's a very clever way of doing it, because Falstaff is in the soliloquy as the exemplar of the world that Hal thinks that he can, when the moment comes, turn his back on, which he does, as we know, successfully and cruelly at the end of Part 2. So those are some examples of how filmmakers adapt the strategy of the soliloquy to the conventions of film.